Hey everyone, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from today. It'd be so cool to hear where everyone is watching from around the world. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching, and maybe share a fun fact about your area. I'm always excited to learn about the different places where our community is connecting. Can't wait to hear your stories. Now, to get into the story I've been meaning to share. Growing up in suburban Ohio, my relationship with nature was, well, complicated. My childhood was filled with organized family picnics, the occasional visit to a national park, and a lot of time spent indoors. It wasn't until my late 20s that I started feeling restless, craving something more authentic, experiences that didn't rely on the comforts and safety nets of civilization. I wanted to truly test myself in the wild. So in June of 2012, I made the decision to go on a solo camping trip to the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. My friends thought I was out of my mind. You've barely camped before, and now you want to go alone to one of the most remote places in Appalachia? My roommate, Jared, asked, concern written all over his face. Maybe he was right, but deep down, something about the challenge of it called to me. I was looking for a test, a way to prove my self-reliance in a way nothing else could satisfy. I spent weeks preparing for the trip. I researched hiking trails, brushed up on survival techniques, and invested in the best equipment I could find to ensure I'd be as self-sufficient as possible. I bought a high-quality tent, a sleeping bag made for the weather, a water filtration system, and enough dehydrated food to last the entire week. All the planning gave me a sense of confidence, like I was really ready for whatever the forest could throw at me. The week before I left, I kept an eye on the weather forecasts. June in West Virginia typically meant warm days and cool nights, with a chance of thunderstorms in the afternoon, but nothing too extreme. At least, that's what I thought. What I didn't account for was the wild unpredictability of the region's weather patterns, especially the fierce summer storms that can develop out of nowhere. I still remember the morning I left Columbus. It was a Tuesday, June 26, 2012. The sunrise was a beautiful mix of orange and pink, and as I packed my gear into my Honda Civic, the air was warm and promising a perfect day ahead. As I pulled away from the curb, I felt a wave of liberation. For the next 5 days, I would be completely on my own, answering to no one but myself in the wilderness. The drive to Monongahela took about 4 hours. As I crossed into West Virginia, the flat farmland started to transform into the rolling hills of Appalachia. The cell service faded, eventually disappearing entirely as I ventured deeper into the forest. That lack of connection to the digital world was strangely freeing. No, it was just me, my thoughts, and the sounds of nature. I arrived at the ranger station around noon. There, I met Bill, an older park ranger with weathered skin from years of working in the mountains. As he stamped my permit, he looked up at the sky with a concerned expression and said, "The weather's been unpredictable lately. Watch the clouds. If they start to darken and the wind picks up, find shelter. We get these summer storms, drettas they call them. They can be nasty." I nodded, but at that moment the sky was still a perfect shade of blue, and I was far too excited about the adventure ahead to think much about his warning. I figured I had everything under control. Oh, how wrong I was. The first day of hiking was everything I hoped for. The trail I picked was challenging enough to feel like an accomplishment, but not so tough that it would discourage me. Dense forests of oak, maple, and hemlock trees created a beautiful canopy overhead, and the sunlight filtered down in patterns on the ground. The cool mountain breezes kept the heat at bay, making the hike much more enjoyable than I expected. I didn't encounter many other hikers, just a couple in their 50s walking in the opposite direction, and a solo backpacker who gave me a quick nod as we passed each other. This solitude was exactly what I was seeking. With each mile, the usual worries and distractions of my life seemed to vanish. All that mattered was moving forward. staying hydrated, and being aware of my surroundings. By late afternoon, I had already covered about 8 miles, which put me ahead of schedule. I found a perfect clearing by a small stream, the sound of the water gurgling over the rocks, providing a peaceful backdrop as I set up camp. Setting up my tent, however, took a bit longer than I expected. The instructions made it look easy, but I struggled with getting everything right. By the time I finally had the tent up, the sun was beginning to set. As I built a small campfire, the first night in the wilderness felt magical. The sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, an owl hooting from a distance, the rustle of leaves in the wind, were so much more soothing than the usual city noise. I gazed at the stars above, their brightness untainted by light pollution. It felt like I could almost reach up and touch the Milky Way. I fell asleep quickly that night, the warmth of my sleeping bag comforting me against the cool mountain air. It was the kind of rest I had been craving, greater clarity of sound. But the forest was eerily quiet. There was no sign of the bear, no movement in the underbrush, just the quiet aftermath of a storm that had left its mark on everything. I stayed in place, still clutching my backpack. My body felt stiff, almost foreign to me after hours of tensing and freezing in the corner of that concrete shelter. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and pine, and the occasional gust of wind pushed through the trees with a low, mournful whistle. The storm had weakened, but the damage it had caused was unmistakable. Everywhere I looked, nature had been reshaped in a violent frenzy, a wild reminder of how quickly everything could change. The fear that had gripped me the night before was still there, but it had shifted. Now it was more of a dull, lingering anxiety, a worry that the bear could still be nearby, waiting for me to make the wrong move. The night felt like an eternity, but the morning light was offering a sense of hope, albeit tentative. I couldn't shake the feeling that this temporary calm might be the quiet before another storm, both literal and metaphorical. I slowly stood up, wincing as my muscles protested from hours of tension. I had barely slept, the weight of my own exhaustion a reminder that I was running on fumes. Every crack of a branch, every gust of wind felt like it could signal another round with the bear. Yet, I had to keep moving. I needed to assess my situation and make a plan for getting out of there. I grabbed my map and pulled out my compass, trying to gauge where I was in relation to the trail and the ranger station. The path I had taken was lost in the haze of the storm's aftermath. I felt disoriented, and the map seemed to blur in my tired eyes. It was hard to tell which direction would lead me out, or if I should even try. The wilderness was still a vast, intimidating place, and it seemed to have its own way of reshaping reality, turning familiar paths into foreign, menacing landscapes. I decided to wait a little longer before attempting to move. My mind was racing, trying to process everything that had happened. The bear, the storm, the endless night of uncertainty. The thought of stepping out into that chaos again was daunting. What if the bear was still around? What if another storm rolled in just as quickly as the last? I had to be sure. The forest had taken on a new life in the light of day. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and although the sky was still heavy with clouds, There was a sense of quiet that replaced the howling winds from the night before. The air felt different now, cooler, cleaner, and the oppressive weight of the storm had lifted, if only slightly. Still, the forest was not a place for hesitation. I knew that. The time had come to make a decision. I stepped out from the shelter, cautiously scanning my surroundings. The ground beneath my feet was slippery with rain-soaked leaves and fallen branches. The trees that had once seemed so comforting now appeared menacing, their twisted limbs and broken trunks a stark reminder of the storm's ferocity. The landscape I had hiked through just days before was barely recognizable, altered by nature's brute force. My heart pounded as I took the first steps into the new, altered wilderness. I didn't know where the bear had gone, but I knew I couldn't afford to linger in the shelter forever. It was time to push forward, to find my way out. But I had to stay alert. The storm had passed, but its aftermath was far from over. I moved slowly at first, each step deliberate. The trail was still faintly visible, but the landscape was so drastically changed that it felt like I was navigating a completely different world. The familiar landmarks were gone, hidden under piles of debris, uprooted trees and branches that had fallen like soldiers in the storm's wake. Every snap of a twig underfoot sent a jolt through me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the bear to emerge from the shadows, its massive form crashing through the underbrush like it had the night before. The tension was unbearable, but I couldn't stop. I had to keep moving, had to find my way to safety, to the ranger station, to civilization, anything that would end this isolation. As I made my way through the forest, the devastation around me became more apparent. The damage was everywhere. It wasn't just the trees that had been shattered, but the very landscape itself had been altered. Paths that once seemed so clear were now blocked, and every turn I made felt like it led to more confusion. I had to stay focused. The storm might have passed, but the danger was still real. I walked for what felt like hours, my legs aching, my stomach growling, my mind still haunted by the events of the night. I was too tired to think straight, too exhausted to feel anything other than the pressing need to get out of there. But the forest seemed endless. The more I moved, the more I realized how small and insignificant I was in the face of it all. The wilderness had its own rules, and I was just a visitor, struggling to make sense of it. Eventually, I came across a small creek. The sound of running water brought a small measure of comfort, grounding me in the present moment. I knelt to refill my water bottles, using the filtration system I had brought with me. The cool, fresh water felt like a lifeline, a reminder that there were still elements of this wild place that could sustain me. As I stood up, I scanned my surroundings. The storm was gone, but the air still felt thick, charged with the remnants of the chaos that had passed through. I wasn't out of danger yet. I couldn't afford to let my guard down. But in that moment I felt a small flicker of hope. I was still alive. The storm had passed. And somehow, I would make it out of this. You need to drive. I stared at him, struggling to make sense of the situation. Every instinct in my body screamed to help, but I knew he was right. I couldn't afford to freeze now. I had to take control of the situation, even if it was just behind the wheel. I nodded, my stomach churning as I climbed into the driver's seat. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white. The engine roared to life, and I slowly pulled the truck out of the campsite, the tires crunching over gravel as I fought to keep my composure. The man in the back was barely conscious, his labored breathing a constant reminder of how fragile life could be in the wild. Mason kept applying pressure to the wound, his voice a steady presence in the chaos. "Keep your eyes on the road. Focus. You're doing great." His words were calm, but I could hear the underlying urgency in them. I glanced in the rearview mirror, catching a glimpse of the man lying motionless in the truck bed. His blood was staining the metal, and the sight made my heart race. The road was winding and treacherous, and I had to keep my focus sharp. My eyes darted between the road and the mirror, checking Mason's progress. He was still doing what he could to stop the bleeding, but I knew time was running out. The nearest town was still miles away, and we had no guarantee that we would make it there in time. As we drove, my mind raced back to the events that had led us here. Just a few days ago, Mason and I had been enjoying the peaceful serenity of the Ozark National Forest. Our biggest concerns were how to catch fish and how to make the most of our time away from the city. Now everything had changed. The world felt upside down, and the calm, tranquil forest had transformed into a dangerous, unpredictable place. I pushed the truck harder, praying that we would make it. The sound of the tires on the gravel road was a steady rhythm, but my thoughts were far from calm. Every bump in the road felt like an eternity. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on me, the fear creeping in with every passing second. After what felt like hours, we finally saw the lights of the small town in the distance. The relief was immediate, but it was also a sharp contrast to the tension that had built up in me. The town was small, but it had a hospital, and that was all that mattered. We pulled up to the emergency room entrance, and I jumped out of the truck, barely waiting for it to stop before rushing to the back.
Mason was already out, his face grim. He had done everything he could, but the man was barely hanging on. We helped him out of the truck and rushed him into the ER, where the medical staff immediately took over. I stepped back, watching as they worked quickly to stabilize him. The whole process was a blur, but I was filled with a sense of helplessness as I realized just how close we had come to losing him. Later, as we sat in the waiting room, Mason and I exchanged looks. Neither of us spoke for a long while, the weight of the events still settling over us. What had started as a peaceful trip into the wilderness had turned into a nightmare, and we weren't even sure what to make of it. The forest, the bear, the injury, it had all come so suddenly, so violently. I thought about the man in the truck, and about how quickly everything had shifted, from normal to terrifying. I couldn't stop thinking about how fragile life was, how easily things could go wrong in the wild. It made me realize how much respect the wilderness demanded, how little control we truly had over it. As Mason and I sat in that sterile hospital waiting room, the quiet around us felt almost as oppressive as the silence in the woods the night before. The weight of everything we had just been through hung heavy between us, but we both knew one thing for sure. We would never take the wilderness, or anything, for granted again. James nodded, his expression softening. I don't know what to say. I just know that my life is different now. Every day I have feels like a gift. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and for the first time in weeks, the tension in the air seemed to ease. But underneath it all, there was an unspoken understanding between us. We'd all been through something that had changed us, something that had shifted our perception of the world. It was like we'd crossed a line, and once you do, there's no going back. We spent the next hour talking, catching up, sharing a few laughs, but there was an underlying weight to the conversation. Every now and then James would pause, his gaze becoming distant, and you could tell he was reflecting on the ordeal. The silence that hung between us wasn't awkward. It was just a reminder of the gravity of what we had all lived through. As we said our goodbyes and parted ways, I found myself thinking about how unpredictable life is. One minute, everything is normal. Plans, expectations, routines. The next, everything is thrown into chaos, and you have to act. You don't get a second chance in those moments. You don't have time to hesitate. And that realization, that awareness of how fragile everything is, stayed with me long after we walked away from James. That night, Mason and I sat together in our new shared apartment, the quiet comfort of normalcy enveloping us. Life had moved on, but we weren't the same. Every once in a while we'd find ourselves reflecting on that trip, on the things we saw, and the things we didn't expect to learn about ourselves. We were living and we were grateful for it, but there was a deep understanding that the world could change in an instant. We kept the lessons from that camping trip close, about preparedness, about taking nothing for granted, and about the preciousness of life. And while I knew the memories would stay with me forever, I also knew that, as strange as it was, that experience had shaped us for the better. It had strengthened our bond, deepened our appreciation for the quiet moments, and reminded us that we couldn't take anything for granted. When we finally put that chapter behind us, the next summer came around, and we found ourselves back in the woods again. But this time, it wasn't about escaping from something. It was about enjoying the peace that nature offers, fully aware of its power, but no longer fearful of it. The wilderness had given us a hard lesson, but in the end, it had brought us closer, and that's something I could hear my father's footsteps echo down the hallway as he made his way to the stairs. My heart was pounding in my chest, the adrenaline surging again as my mind replayed the terrifying moment outside the tent. What had just happened? Had I imagined it? Was it really someone out there? I stood frozen, the air thick with fear, my body caught between the need to act and the overwhelming sense of helplessness. Audrey and Jasmine were beside me, their wide eyes reflecting the same panic I felt. We were all in shock, trying to process what had just unfolded, yet still unable to shake the image of the shadowy figure at the tent entrance. The unknown, the terrifying unknown. Do you think it was a prank? Jasmine's voice trembled, but there was a hint of doubt in her words, as if she was trying to convince herself that everything could be explained. I wanted to believe that too, but deep down, I knew what I'd heard. The voice wasn't my father's. No, Jasmine, I whispered, the words barely escaping my throat. That wasn't him. It wasn't a joke. We sat in the dimly lit room, huddled together, as the seconds stretched into what felt like hours. The quiet seemed almost unbearable now, each tiny sound amplified in the stillness. The wind outside rustled the leaves, and the trees creaked in the night, but none of those sounds could cover the thudding of my heart or the gnawing fear in the pit of my stomach. Minutes later, my father returned, his face grim and his eyes scanning the hallway as he passed the door. He didn't say a word, just made sure we were all in the room and locked the door behind him. They're on their way, he said, his voice low and steady despite the urgency of the situation. I didn't see anyone around the house, but I'm going to check the yard one more time. No, Dad, I protested, my voice cracking with fear. Don't go out there. What if he's still there? My father paused, his hand on the door handle, and turned back to us. He looked at me, his expression softening just slightly. I'll be careful. You stay here with your mother. Keep the door locked. I promise. Nothing's going to happen. He left, and I could hear his footsteps retreating down the hallway, followed by the quiet click of the back door as he stepped outside. The house seemed so still now, so empty. It was as if the entire world had held its breath with us, waiting for something to happen. The minutes stretched on. My thoughts raced, trying to make sense of everything. I kept thinking about the figure at the tent, the words it had spoken, the way it had moved with such purpose, and how everything in my gut had screamed that it was wrong. We weren't just dealing with a prank anymore. This was real. Jasmine and Audrey sat on the bed, trying to comfort each other, but I could tell they were just as scared as I was. I was terrified for all of us. What had we stumbled into? Who was out there in the dark, watching us? The sirens in the distance broke the silence, and it was like the tension in the room broke with them. My dad had called the police. Help was on the way. We waited. After what felt like forever, my father returned, his face even more serious than before. "They're coming," he said, his voice clipped. "But I need to check something first. Stay here." "Please, don't," I begged, but he was already moving. "Stay inside with us," I insisted. But he was determined. "Stay here. I'll be quick. Just stay put," he said, his voice firm. This time, he didn't wait for our protests. He walked toward the door, leaving us behind. My mother, who had been unusually calm until now, placed a hand on my shoulder. "It'll be okay," she said, her voice steady, but I could tell that even she wasn't so sure. We waited for what seemed like an eternity, but I didn't feel the relief I thought I would when my father finally returned. His face was pale, and there was an odd, unspoken tension in the air. "The yard's clear," he said quickly, but I could hear the unease in his voice. "But I want you girls to stay inside. I'll keep watch. If you hear anything, don't open the door. Don't even speak." I felt the weight of his words, his seriousness settling over me like a heavy blanket. For the first time in my life, the house felt unsafe. The world outside had become a place of danger, and I had no idea what we were facing. The night dragged on, and we stayed huddled together, not daring to leave the room. The sounds of the house, the occasional creak of the floors, the wind rustling outside, it all seemed amplified now, unsettling in its normalcy. Eventually, the police arrived. The officers took over the investigation, asking us questions and assuring us that they would look into the situation. But even after everything, even with their presence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, that something still wasn't right. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest as I stared at the woman standing a few feet away. How had she gotten so close without me hearing? The forest around us, which had been eerily quiet moments before, now seemed to hold its breath. My mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation, trying to figure out if this was some kind of bizarre coincidence or something far more unsettling. Hi," I stammered, still holding the lug wrench in my hand, like some sort of feeble weapon. I didn't hear you coming." Winter's gaze remained steady, but there was no hint of aggression in her expression. She didn't seem threatening, just out of place. She looked like someone who belonged to a different world entirely, one far removed from the normal rhythms of a family camping trip. Her eyes were intense, but not unfriendly. "See that?" she said, her voice soft but clear, with a strange sense of calm. "That tire's in pretty rough shape. Looks like you've got a big problem." I couldn't help but glance back at the shredded tire, still feeling the unsettling weight of her presence. This wasn't just a casual encounter. Something about the way she spoke, and the way she seemed to appear out of nowhere, made me uneasy. My mind raced for an explanation. "Yeah, it's completely flat. I was just, changing it," I said, trying to sound normal despite the unease gnawing at my stomach. "But it looks like I'll need to find a place to get it fixed. We're about 30 minutes from the nearest town." Winter nodded slowly, her gaze moving from the tire to the surrounding forest. "Lucky you stopped here. Not much traffic on this road. You're in a bit of a spot, though. Not a lot of folks come through these parts, especially not this early." I felt a chill, despite the warmth of the morning. "Yeah, it's pretty remote," I said, still trying to figure out who she was and what she was doing here. "I don't suppose you know how to fix tires, do you?" She smiled, a soft, knowing smile. "Not my specialty," she replied, "but I can show you how to get out of here if you need help." I glanced at the truck, then back at her. Her presence was starting to feel more like a warning than a comfort. "I appreciate the offer, but I think I've got it covered," I said, unsure of how else to respond. She took a step closer, her gaze never wavering. "If you're sure," she said softly, "but there's more danger around here than you realize, especially if you're out here alone." Her words hit me harder than I expected. My instinct was to brush it off, but something in her tone, something in her eyes, made me pause. The rustling in the trees, the strange unease I'd felt earlier. It was all starting to make sense in a way I didn't want it to. "Look, I'm fine," I said, shaking off the anxiety creeping up my spine. "We'll be okay. I just need to finish this and get the family on our way." Winter didn't seem to care about my assurances. She took another slow step forward, her eyes scanning the surrounding woods. "You might not want to stick around too long. There's a lot of things out here that don't show themselves at first, things you won't notice until it's too late." I swallowed hard, trying not to show how rattled I was. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, forcing a smile, "but we'll be fine." For a moment, Winter just stood there, staring at me with a look that made me feel like she could see right through me. Then she slowly nodded and turned, moving toward the edge of the woods. "I'll let you be then," she said, her voice drifting back to me. "But remember, not as alone as you think you are." She disappeared into the trees with almost no sound, her presence fading as quickly as it had arrived. I stood there for a moment, the lug wrench still in my hand, a strange mix of relief and lingering unease knotting in my chest. I couldn't explain why, but something about that encounter, her sudden appearance, her cryptic words, didn't sit right. Shaking my head, I quickly finished changing the tire, trying to dismiss the unsettling feeling that lingered. But even as I climbed back into the truck and started the engine, I couldn't shake the thought that Winter had been more than just an unexpected stranger on a remote road. She had been a warning. The officer's words sent a shiver down my spine. Something much worse. I couldn't shake the thought of how close we had come to being another statistic in their twisted pattern. I looked over at Josephine, who was holding the children close, her hand reassuringly resting on Michael's shoulder. I could see that the strain of the past few days had worn on her too. But we had made it. We were safe, and that was all that mattered. "We're grateful," I said, nodding to Officer Bennett, "for everything. You really helped us." Officer Bennett gave a small, understanding smile, but there was a certain sadness in his eyes. "Just glad we could catch them before they hurt anyone else," he replied, his voice soft but firm. "You folks take care of each other out there." We left the police station with a mixture of relief and lingering anxiety. The drive home was quiet, the usual buzz of the highway drowned out by the weight of everything we'd experienced. The kids were mostly quiet, probably still processing the events in their own way, while Josephine and I exchanged glances every so often, silently communicating the gravity of what had happened. "I think we can all agree," Josephine finally said, breaking the silence. "That's one camping trip we won't forget." I chuckled, though it was a hollow laugh. Yeah, no kidding. The rest of the trip back home was uneventful, as Officer Bennett had predicted. The roads that had once seemed so menacing now appeared ordinary, and as we passed the places where the previous days had unfolded, the tension I'd carried with me seemed to slowly dissolve into the landscape. When we finally pulled into our driveway, I felt a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. The familiar comfort of our home seemed to embrace us, grounding us back to reality. We were safe, and that was the most important thing. Over the following weeks, the weight of the experience began to settle into our lives. The kids, with their resilience, adjusted more quickly than I expected. They went back to school, resumed their routines, and began to talk about the trip with more lightness, though the subject was never completely forgotten. Josephine and I, on the other hand, continued to wrestle with the residual effects. I'd find myself checking the locks at night more than usual, scanning unfamiliar faces when we were out in public, and occasionally catching Josephine's eyes with the same unspoken recognition of the fear we had lived through. The following month, we received a letter from the police informing us that Winter and Warren had been formally charged with multiple counts of robbery, assault, and most chillingly, the suspected disappearances. The authorities believe they had been targeting isolated travelers for months, always striking when people were most vulnerable. They were now in custody, and their chances of ever harming anyone again were slim. That piece of news, along with the knowledge that they would be behind bars for a long time, offered some sense of closure. But there was still a part of me that couldn't shake the memories of their faces. Winter's unsettling smile, Warren's hollow eyes, and the feeling that we had narrowly escaped something far darker than we had originally realized. Josephine and I both agreed that it would take time to fully heal from what had happened. We knew that, but we also understood that life couldn't stop because of the terror we'd faced. We had our family, and we had each other, and that, in the end, was what mattered most. As the months went by, we continued to navigate life with more awareness. We knew that we'd never be the same, but we also understood that the experience had forged something stronger between us. We still went camping from time to time, but we stayed closer to home, in more populated areas, taking every precaution we could. We'd learned the hard way that while the wilderness was beautiful, it could also be a place where danger lurked in unexpected ways. And through it all, we never forgot the lesson Winter and Warren had taught us, that safety is never guaranteed, but love, family, and the courage to stand together in the face of adversity were worth more than anything else. And in the end, that was the victory we carried with us. It wasn't the victory of survival alone. It was the victory of resilience and the knowledge that no matter what came up. His words confirmed what I had sensed during our encounter, that Winter and Warren had intended more than mere theft. The realization of how close we had come to becoming statistics was sobering. In the weeks that followed our return home, life gradually returned to normal. The camping gear was stored away. The photographs from our trip were shared with friends and family, and the routine of work and school resumed. But something had changed within me, a fundamental shift in how I perceived the world and its dangers. I found myself more cautious in unfamiliar situations, more aware of my surroundings, more protective of my family, not in a paralyzing way, but in a manner that acknowledged the reality that threats could emerge from unexpected quarters. The world was no longer just a place of beauty, but also one where danger could appear, sometimes without warning. 6 months after our camping trip, I received a call from Officer Bennett. The Reynolds siblings have been convicted on multiple counts of robbery, assault, and, in Warren's case, second-degree murder. They would be serving lengthy sentences in separate maximum security facilities. That evening, as I watched Abigail and Michael playing in the backyard, Josephine joined me on the porch. "You're thinking about them, aren't you?" she asked quietly. "The Reynolds?" I nodded. I was thinking about how different things could have turned out if I hadn't noticed the knife. If you hadn't woken up when you did. Josephine leaned against me, her presence solid and reassuring. "But that's not what happened. You protected us. We survived, and now they can't hurt anyone else."
As the sun set over our peaceful neighborhood, I made a decision. We would go camping again the following summer. We would not allow fear to dictate our choices or limit our experiences, but we would be wiser, more prepared, more aware of the potential dangers that exist in remote places. The world contains both beauty and threat, often side by side. The challenge is to appreciate the former, while respecting the latter. To find the balance that allows for adventure without recklessness, caution without paranoia. Our camping trip of 2021 taught me this lesson in the most visceral way possible. And while I hope never again to face a situation as terrifying as our encounter with Winter and Warren Reynolds, I carry the wisdom gained from that experience with me still, a permanent addition to how I navigate the world and protect those I love.